The Texas sunrise crept over the horizon, painting the wild grasses with a golden sheen. I, Caleb Monroe, stood before the rusted iron gate of the Monroe family farm, 150 acres steeped in the toil and dreams of my forebears since 1880. After 3 years in Europe reviving depleted farmlands, I returned with a heart full of longing, eager to reconnect with the soil that raised me. Tucked in my jacket pocket was the deed bearing my name, a fragile sheet that held the weight of my family's legacy. But as I fumbled the key into the gate's lock, a voice cut through the morning calm like a whip. "Get away from that fence or I'm calling the police." I froze, my gaze snapping up. A woman in a blinding orange vest, oversized sunglasses masking half her face, stormed toward me as if I were a thief breaching her stronghold. Diane, as I'd later learn, was the head of the Homeowners Association, HOA. Her expression a mix of fury and triumph, her clipboard gripped like a badge of dominion. I stood there, keys dangling, a half-smile flickering as I thought she'd mistaken me for someone else. But Diane wasn't confused. To her, my family's farm, where my great-grandfather broke the earth, where my mother's laughter once echoed, was now the Willow Creek HOA community garden. And I was an intruder. My pulse quickened not from fear, but from a deep, burning anger. This was my land, my heritage, carved from decades of sweat and sacrifice. Yet here it was, defaced by tacky plastic signs, a stranger's padlock, and garden beds that didn't belong. I steadied my breath, keeping my tone even, and said I was the owner, just checking on my property. Diane's laugh was sharp, venomous. "We've dealt with liars like you before, thinking you can claim open land. Leave now." She whipped out her phone, filming me like I was a fugitive about to bolt with the barn. Then, without a second's pause, she dialed the police. I leaned against the fence, arms folded, a storm of rage and disbelief churning inside. Hours earlier, I'd been dreaming of restoring the historic barn, sowing wheat, breathing life back into the farm. Now, on the very ground my family built, I was cast as a criminal. As the police car's lights flickered in the distance, dust rising from the road, I tightened my grip on the deed in my pocket. This wasn't a simple mix-up. It was an assault on everything I held dear. Diane thought she could erase my family's history with her signs and locks, but I'd fight tooth and nail to reclaim what was mine, no matter the cost. The wail of a police siren in the distance snapped me, Caleb Monroe, out of the seething anger that had gripped me after my confrontation with Diane. Just minutes earlier, I'd stood on my family's land, the Monroe farm, 150 acres steeped in legacy since 1880, accused of being a trespasser by the woman claiming to be the HOA president. Diane, in her garish orange vest and cutting voice, had filmed me, called the cops, and declared this land the Willow Creek community garden of her HOA. Now, as the patrol car pulled up, dust swirling in its wake, I leaned against the fence, my hand gripping the deed in my pocket, my heart a mix of fury and resolve. I dreamed of restoring this farm, the historic barn, the wheat fields, but instead I was forced to prove my ownership on my own soil. 2 officers stepped out, one calm, the other seeming familiar with Diane. She rushed forward, pointing at me as if I were a fugitive fresh from a jailbreak, her voice shrill. "He climbed the gate, trying to steal community land. This is HOA property." I took a deep breath, keeping my tone steady despite the anger pulsing through me. "I'm Caleb Monroe, the owner of this farm," I said, pulling out my ID and a title card with a QR code linking directly to the county registry. "Scan this and you'll see I'm the legal owner." Diane scoffed, but her eyes flickered with unease. She shoved a thick folder at the calm officer, who introduced himself as Officer Bennett. "This is the HOA's deed, proving community ownership." "He's aggressive and trespassing," she insisted, her voice smug. I stood there, feeling heat rise in my chest, but I forced myself to stay composed. This wasn't just land, it was where my great-grandfather tilled the soil, where my father taught me to tie a knot, where my mother planted wildflowers. Bennett took my card, scanned the QR code with his phone. The screen lit up and I saw his eyes narrow, then widen. "Ma'am," he turned to Diane, his voice firm. "The county registry confirms Mr. Caleb Monroe as the sole owner of this parcel. Your document doesn't match." The air seemed to freeze. Diane's mouth fell open, her face paling as if slapped. "That's a mistake," she stammered. "We annexed this land years ago." But her voice trembled, unconvincing. The other officer, who seemed to know Diane, stepped back, looking uneasy. Bennett handed her folder back, shaking his head. "You're interfering with private property. We need to discuss this deed of yours." Relief washed over me, tangled with outrage. Relief that the truth was confirmed, but outrage that Diane dared to orchestrate this farce, turning my family's legacy into her con. She backed away, lips pressed tight, but still clung to defiance. "You'll hear from our lawyer." Bennett just stared, his gaze sharp as a blade. As the officers left, Diane turned, hurrying toward the barn, now sporting a new lock I hadn't installed. I stood there, hands trembling slightly from adrenaline, staring at the weathered iron gate. This fight was just beginning, but I swore I'd defend the Monroe farm, no matter what it took to dismantle Diane's schemes. The police cars had barely disappeared down the dusty road, leaving behind the bitter aftertaste of my clash with Diane, when I, Caleb Monroe, turned to face the full extent of the violation on my family's farm. The confrontation with Officer Bennett had confirmed my ownership of the 150-acre Monroe farm, a legacy rooted in 1880, and exposed Diane's fraudulent HOA deed for the sham it was. Yet, as I stood by the iron gate, the weight of her audacity sank in deeper. Diane's smug retreat to the barn, her muttered threats of lawyers, lingered in my mind, fueling a mix of fury and determination. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a calculated takeover, and I needed to uncover how far it had gone. With the deed still clutched in my pocket, I stepped onto the soil my great-grandfather had tilled, ready to reclaim what was mine. As I walked the land, my heart sank at the sight before me. The familiar landscape of my childhood was unrecognizable. Where wheat fields once swayed, raised garden beds now stood, neatly lined with vegetables that had no place here. A gaudy gazebo squatted in the middle of the pasture, its bright paint an insult to the weathered beauty of the farm. Solar-powered lights, cheap and out of place, dotted the driveway, and most galling of all, lawn gnomes littered the perimeter of the historic barn. My chest tightened with a pang of grief. This was the barn where my father stored his tools, where my mother hung lanterns for summer gatherings. Now it was surrounded by Diane's tacky decorations, a new padlock gleaming on its door, mocking my family's history. The hand-carved Monroe farm sign, crafted by my great-grandfather, was gone, replaced by a plastic plaque proclaiming Willow Creek HOA Community Garden members only. Each discovery felt like a wound, slicing through the memories I'd carried through my 3 years in Europe. Driven by a mix of outrage and resolve, I drove to the county recorder's office the next morning, determined to dig into Diane's claims. The clerk, a kind woman with a furrowed brow, listened as I explained the situation. When I gave her the parcel number, her frown deepened. "There's an HOA community overlay claim filed 9 months ago," she said, pulling up the file. My stomach churned as she handed me a packet. The document, slapped together with the confidence of a con artist, declared the Monroe farm abandoned, and claimed the HOA had beautified it for community use. Diane's name was scrawled across the top, but the glaring flaw was impossible to miss. The claim lacked my signature, the legal consent of the owner. It was incomplete, a flimsy attempt at theft dressed up in bureaucratic jargon. A neighborhood survey attached to it looked more like a potluck guest list than a legal record. I nearly laughed, but the humor was drowned by disgust. This wasn't just overreach. It was a deliberate attempt to erase my family's legacy. I left the office clutching the packet, my mind racing with anger and clarity. Diane hadn't just trespassed. She'd orchestrated a scheme to steal my land, banking on my absence to push it through. The garden beds, the gazebo, the gnomes, they weren't random. They were props in her bid to rewrite history. As I drove back to the farm, the image of my great-grandfather's sign, now missing, burned in my mind. This was more than a fight over property. It was a battle for my heritage, and I'd be damned if I let Diane's lies strip it away. The revelation of Diane's fraudulent claim at the county recorder's office left me, Caleb Monroe, reeling with a mix of fury and resolve. The incomplete HOA packet, declaring my family's 150-acre Monroe farm abandoned and beautified without my consent, was a blatant attempt to steal the land my great-grandfather had carved out in 1880. The sight of raised garden beds, a garish gazebo, and lawn gnomes desecrating the farm, coupled with the missing hand-carved Monroe sign, ignited a fire in me. Diane's scheme wasn't just trespassing. It was an assault on my heritage. After confirming my ownership with the police and uncovering her sham paperwork, I knew this fight required more than words. It demanded action, and I was ready to wage war to protect the legacy etched into every inch of this soil. That evening I called Greg, an old friend and property lawyer whose sharp mind I trusted implicitly. As I recounted Diane's takeover, her fake deed, the illegal structures, the audacity of her community garden claim, his voice grew incredulous. "This is land theft, plain and simple," he said, his tone mirroring my outrage. Together we drafted a cease and desist letter, a legal missile aimed at Diane and her HOA. The letter demanded the immediate removal of all unauthorized structures, gazebo, garden beds, solar lights, and those damned gnomes, within 10 days, threatening legal action if they failed to comply. As I signed the document, my hand trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of defending a century of family history. I laminated copies, determined to deliver them personally, my heart pounding with a mix of defiance and anticipation. But I needed more than paperwork to dismantle Diane's scheme. She was cunning, and I couldn't trust her to back down quietly. Driven by a gut feeling that she'd escalate, I invested in trail cameras, the kind hunters used to track game. Under the cover of dusk, I hid them strategically across the farm, tucked in the branches of the old pecan trees, nestled behind fence posts, even rigged to the barn's weather vane. Each installation felt like a small act of rebellion, a way to reclaim control over my land. The cameras were my eyes, ready to catch Diane's next move. My chest tightened with a blend of hope and dread as I set them up, imagining what they might reveal about her plans to further defile my family's legacy. 2 nights later, my phone pinged with a notification that stopped my heart. Footage from the barn camera showed Diane and 2 HOA board members, flashlights slicing through the dark, huddled around my father's old workbench. My blood ran cold as I watched. Diane spread out diagrams, her voice low but clear. "We'll hold a ribbon cutting here, get Channel 5 to cover it. Go public fast and his ownership won't matter. Public opinion wins." A man with a man bun nodded, adding, "Make it look like it's always been ours. He's the trespasser." The words hit like a punch, confirming my worst fears. This wasn't just about garden beds. It was a calculated media stunt to cement their claim. My hands shook with rage, but a grim satisfaction settled in. The cameras had done their job, capturing undeniable proof of Diane's conspiracy. As I saved the footage, my resolve hardened. This was no longer just a legal battle. It was a fight to expose her lies and restore the Monroe farm's truth, no matter how dirty she played. The trail camera footage of Diane and her HOA cronies plotting in my family's barn at night burned in my mind, fueling a righteous anger that kept me, Caleb Monroe, awake long after the screen went dark. Their plan to stage a public ribbon cutting and manipulate the narrative to paint me as the trespasser on my own 150-acre Monroe farm, a legacy rooted in 1880, was a brazen escalation. The cease and desist letter, crafted with my lawyer Greg, was already in motion, demanding Diane remove her illegal gazebo, garden beds, and gnomes within 10 days. The cameras I'd hidden across the farm had delivered ironclad evidence of her conspiracy, but I knew exposing her privately wouldn't be enough. Diane craved the spotlight, banking on public opinion to legitimize her theft. If she wanted a stage, I'd give her one. A public unmasking that would dismantle her lies and restore my family's honor. My heart raced with a mix of fury and determination as I reached for my phone to call an old ally. Sarah, a college friend turned investigative reporter, answered on the second ring. Her voice lit up when I explained the situation: Diane's fraudulent claim, the fake HOA deed, the secret barn meeting. When I sent her the footage, her gasp was audible. "Caleb, this is a bombshell. HOA fraud, forged documents, a historic farm. This could be huge," she said, her excitement mirroring the fire in my chest. I didn't want fame, only justice, but if Diane's downfall required a spotlight, I'd shine it on her. Sarah arrived the next morning with a news crew, her professionalism a stark contrast to the surreal scene on my land. As we walked the farm, I pointed out the violations: the raised garden beds where wheat once grew, the garish gazebo defiling the pasture, the plastic Willow Creek HOA community garden signs replacing my great-grandfather's hand-carved Monroe farm marker. Each step deepened the ache in my heart, but sharing the truth with Sarah felt like reclaiming a piece of what Diane had stolen. The crew filmed an interview under the century-old oak, the heart of the farm, where I poured out my family's history and Diane's betrayal. Showing them the barn footage, I watched their jaws drop as Diane's voice schemed about media manipulation. My hands trembled not from nerves, but from the weight of exposing a truth that could free my land. The segment aired that night and the response was explosive. My inbox flooded with emails from neighbors, many revealing their own frustrations with Diane's suburban tyranny. The broadcast triggered a cascade of leaks. Internal HOA texts surfaced online, exposing Diane's lie that the farm had been donated to the community. One message from her to a board member read, "Just keep saying it's ours, no one checks." My stomach churned with disgust, but a surge of vindication followed. The community was waking up, seeing Diane for the fraud she was. The fallout shook the HOA to its core. Neighbors who'd bought into Diane's community garden scam, some paying hundreds for access, began questioning her authority. Social media buzzed with outrage, calling her a suburban dictator. Each post felt like a small victory, chipping away at the empire she'd built on my land. Yet, as I stood on the porch that night, the barn's silhouette glowing under the moon, I felt a bittersweet resolve. The public fight was working, but it was a painful reminder of how close I'd come to losing my family's legacy. Diane wanted a war of perception, she'd get one, and I'd make sure the truth won. The wildfire of public outrage sparked by Sarah's investigative report still blazed in my mind, each neighbor's email and leaked HOA text fueling my resolve to reclaim the Monroe farm. Diane's lies, claiming my family's 150-acre legacy, rooted in 1880, was a donated community garden, had been exposed, and her grip on the narrative was crumbling. The footage of her scheming in my barn captured by trail cameras had turned the tide, but I, Caleb Monroe, knew the fight wasn't over. The cease and desist letter, backed by my lawyer Greg, and the county's confirmation of my ownership were solid, yet Diane's audacity suggested she'd cling to her fiction. As I stood on the farm's porch, the sting of her plastic Willow Creek HOA signs replacing my great-grandfather's hand-carved marker gnawed at me. I needed to rally the community, not just to expose Diane, but to rebuild the trust her deception had fractured. My heart swelled with a mix of hope and defiance. This land was mine, and I'd prove it to everyone. A stroke of fortune arrived at noon when a silver truck rolled up, driven by Frank Larson, the original developer of the surrounding neighborhood. Wearing a faded 1970s zoning cap, he stepped out, his weathered hands clutching a rolled-up map. "Saw the news," he said gruffly, his eyes scanning the farm. "Your land was never HOA property. I made sure of it." My chest tightened with gratitude as he unrolled the zoning map, his finger jabbing at the Monroe farm's boundaries, clearly marked as exempt from HOA jurisdiction. His memos, yellowed but meticulous, detailed the farm's heritage status. "This is gold," I whispered, scanning the documents for Greg. Frank's evidence wasn't just legal. It was a lifeline to my family's history, a shield against Diane's lies. I felt a surge of pride, knowing my ancestors' foresight had protected this land even now. Emboldened, I organized a community meet and greet on the farm, inviting neighbors for coffee under the century-old oak. Sarah's news crew agreed to cover it, amplifying the truth. I set up tables displaying the deed, Frank's zoning map, and a looping playback of the barn footage exposing Diane's plot. My hands shook as I arranged the evidence, not from fear, but from the weight of sharing my family's story. Neighbors arrived, some skeptical, others curious. As I spoke about the farm's history, my great-grandfather's plow, my mother's wildflower patches, eyes softened. The footage of Diane's midnight scheming drew gasps. Frank's map silenced doubts. My voice cracked with emotion as I held up the deed, declaring, "This is my home, not her garden." The crowd nodded, their murmurs turning to support. The turning point came when neighbors shared their own stories. A couple admitted paying $700 to join Diane's donated garden, only to face her threats when they questioned access. A mother revealed Diane banned her child from a barn swing over unpaid harvest dues. My stomach churned with disgust at Diane's exploitation, but my heart lifted as the community rallied. One man, a retired teacher, clapped my shoulder saying, "We're with you, Caleb." The event shifted the narrative. Neighbors who'd glared at me days earlier now apologized, offering produce and help to remove the gazebo. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the farm, I felt a bittersweet triumph. Diane's lies had unraveled, And with Frank's evidence and the community's support, the Monroe farm stood stronger. This wasn't just a victory over her. It was a reclamation of my heritage, forged in truth and solidarity. The community meet and greet under the ancient oak of the Monroe farm, bolstered by Frank Larson's irrefutable zoning map and the damning barn footage, had turned the tide against Diane's lies. Neighbors once swayed by her Willow Creek HOA community garden farce now stood with me, Caleb Monroe, their stories of her deceit echoing my own. The 150-acre farm, my family's legacy since 1880, was no longer just my fight. It was a shared cause, fueled by the truth Sarah's news report had amplified. Yet, as I savored the community's support, a nagging dread lingered. Diane's silence after the event felt too calculated, like the calm before a storm. My heart, buoyed by hope, braced for her next move, knowing she wouldn't surrender my land without a final desperate strike. Her counterattack came swiftly. An emergency injunction filed with the court, claiming the Monroe farm was in ownership limbo and should be declared public until resolved. The audacity of her claim, after her fraudulent deed was debunked and her HOA texts exposed, sent a jolt of fury through me. She'd called me a transient of unknown background in the filing, a slur that stung not just me but the memory of my great-grandfather, who'd carved this land from nothing. I clutched the cease and desist letter Greg and I had sent, my resolve hardening. This wasn't just about property. It was about defending a century of sacrifice against her relentless greed. Greg laughed at the sloppy filing, his confidence easing my nerves, but as we prepared for the hearing, my stomach churned with anticipation. Diane's lies had to end here. In the courtroom the air was thick with tension. Diane's lawyer, a nervous man in a cheap suit, rambled about community bonding and emotional harm caused by my reclaiming efforts. Each word felt like a dagger aimed at my family's legacy, but I sat tall, my hands steady despite the anger simmering within. Greg presented our case with surgical precision. The deed, Frank's zoning map, the barn footage, and the county's confirmation of my sole ownership. The leaked HOA texts, revealing Diane's lie about a donated farm, drew a murmur from the gallery. My chest tightened with pride as the judge. A stern woman with sharp eyes leaned forward, her gaze piercing Diane's lawyer. "This filing is baseless," she declared, her voice cutting through the room. "Mr. Monroe is the undisputed owner. The injunction is denied. Further interference will be treated as harassment." A wave of relief crashed over me, mingled with triumph. The farm was mine, affirmed by law, untouchable by Diane's schemes. The fallout was swift and brutal. Diane's face drained of color, her protests silenced by her lawyer's frantic whispers. The judge's ruling opened the floodgates. Diane faced fines for trespassing, compounded by her stunt of hiring 2 men in fake HOA security polos to patrol my gate. My blood boiled at the memory of their smug faces, but the real blow came when investigations revealed she'd embezzled HOA funds for her legal battles, porch furniture, and landscaping. The news hit like a thunderclap. Her home was seized for restitution, her reign as HOA tyrant reduced to rubble. As I stood on the farm that evening, the barn glowing under the setting sun, a quiet joy settled in my heart. The legal victory wasn't just mine. It was for my ancestors, whose legacy Diane had tried to erase. Her downfall was justice, hard-won, and the Monroe farm stood taller for it. The courtroom victory, where the judge's gavel affirmed my rightful ownership of the 150-acre Monroe farm, was a triumph that echoed beyond the legal realm for me, Caleb Monroe. Diane's desperate injunction, her lies about my family's legacy since 1880 being public land, had crumbled under the weight of truth, my deed, Frank's zoning map, and her own damning HOA texts. Her fines for trespassing and hiring fake security, coupled with the investigation into her embezzlement of HOA funds, marked the end of her reign. Yet, as I stood on the farm's porch, the weight of the battle lingered in my heart, a mix of relief and resolve. Diane's defeat was justice, but the scars she left, her gazebo, garden beds, and missing Monroe sign demanded healing. This land, my ancestors' pride, deserved more than victory. It deserved restoration, and I vowed to make it whole again. Diane's downfall was as swift as it was public. Her home, funded partly by misappropriated HOA dues, was seized to cover restitution for her legal bills, landscaping, and furniture. A viral photo of her on the curb, surrounded by belongings, became a symbol of her disgrace, and my heart stirred with grim satisfaction. Her blog, My Truth, a last-ditch attempt to paint herself as a victim of lawless owners, fizzled after 3 rants drowned by public scorn. Neighbors who once feared her now called her a cautionary tale, their emails to me brimming with apologies and support. Winning the defamation lawsuit against her brought not just financial damages but a deeper vindication. Every cent she paid for legal fees and garden refunds felt like a brick laid to rebuild my family's honor. Yet, as I framed that photo for the barn, a bittersweet pang hit me. The fight had been brutal, but it forged a stronger legacy. Restoration became my mission. I tore down Diane's garish structures, the gazebo, the solar lights, the gnomes, each removal a cathartic act of reclaiming my land. The barn, once defiled by her secret meetings, I transformed into a mini-museum, its walls adorned with family photos, my great-grandfather's tools, and the story of our fight. Standing inside, I felt a lump in my throat, imagining my parents' pride. Partnering with a nonprofit, I launched a legal community garden, inviting neighbors to plant and harvest freely, a stark contrast to Diane's pay-to-play scam. The farm opened its gates to school field trips and community events, laughter replacing the tension of months past. My heart swelled as kids ran through pumpkin rows at the fall market, once Diane's domain, now hosted on my land, free and open to all. The crowning touch was a new sign. Monroe Family Farm restored private property, HOA fines laughed at. Its bold letters, carved by a local artisan, stood where Diane's plastic plaque once mocked my heritage. Each glance at it sparked a quiet joy, a reminder of resilience. The farm wasn't just mine. It was a beacon of legacy, stronger for the battle. Neighbors, once divided, now gathered under the old oak, sharing stories of the land's history. As I sat on the porch one evening, mug in hand, the sun painting the barn gold, I felt a profound peace. Diane's schemes had tested me, but they'd also united a community and fortified my roots. The Monroe farm, bathed in twilight, stood not just restored but reborn, a testament to truth, grit, and the enduring power of home.